here, our first day of our journey through the Word. I hope you're as excited about this journey as I am. And so let's not waste any time and let's get started. As we look at our trail map and go to Genesis chapter 1, we find that it begins this way. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created. I want you to notice how it begins. In the beginning, God. It's so important that we understand this foundation. This is the foundation of everything that we will see as we go along this journey. This is the foundation that this world is set upon. This is the foundation that our existence is set upon. It doesn't say in the beginning, man. It says in the beginning, God. There are different terms for God, and as we look at this term, we find that it's Elohim. What does Elohim mean, and how does it differ from the name that maybe you know him by, or you have heard, Yahweh? You'll hear me often say Yahuwah, and I'll explain that at a different time. But what's the difference between Elohim and Yahweh? As we look at the name Elohim, we find that the name Elohim is related to the judge. It's the one who has the right to determine. Also, it's the name of the lawgiver. When God created this world, he created it upon his laws. He created the laws of nature, but not just the laws of nature. God created the laws that would cause man to know him and for man to be ruled by God's laws. Those laws existed before man was ever created. Those laws existed before heaven and earth were created. Those laws existed in God's throne, in his place of habitation. So how does Elohim differ from Yahuwah, Yahweh? Yahweh, the name Yahweh, shows God as a compassionate God, a merciful God. Aren't we thankful that throughout the Bible, we don't just see God as judge, God as ruler, but throughout the Bible, we watch God walk with his creation as Yahweh, the compassionate, merciful God. As we continue our journey, we look at Genesis chapter 1, and we see how God created. If you look at days 1 through 3, you're going to find that those were days that God brought things into existence. And to do that, he did it through a series of separations. We know on day 1, God said, let there be light. And it says, and God separated the light from the darkness. On day 2, we know that it says God separated the waters from the waters. On day 3, we know that God separated the waters from the dry land. And then on days 4, 5, and 6, God begins to fill those places, the sky, the earth, and the waters with life. It kind of reminds me of an artist who begins his painting by doing the background first. He puts the colors of sky and water, but there are no details. And then as he continues to paint, now he begins to add those details. And that's how God created this earth. He put the backdrop, and then he started to fill in that backdrop with details. As we move on to Genesis chapter 2, there are some who would try to tell us that there were 2 creations, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. No, there's one creation. And so in Genesis 1, it shows us the heavens and the earth that he made. But it's not till Genesis 2 that we begin to see God's relationship with man. And it's interesting to see that the term Yahweh is not mentioned anywhere in Genesis chapter 1. So in Genesis chapter 2, we now see the name of Yahweh introduced. Why? Because now in Genesis chapter 2, we're going to see how God interacts with this man that he has created. And the beautiful part about this is we see that in Genesis 1, God says, I'm going to make this man so that he will have dominion over all that I created. In Genesis chapter 2, we see that that God takes man and he puts him in the garden. And there was this world outside, but it says God planted a garden and he brought man in and he said, Adam, I want you to take care of my garden. Not just all that I create. I want you to take care of what is mine. There's a real message in that for us. Our existence and our knowledge of God is to cause us to partner with him. Adam did partner with God, and God wanted Adam to be a co-ruler with him. We see that God creates all the animals as he's beginning to fill this earth, and he says, Adam, come with me. I want you to name the things that I have created. God didn't tell him what to call them. God brought Adam into his work with him. And so we see this lovely relationship between God and Adam. And not only that, now God wants Adam to understand the relationship that he will have between the other beings that God will create. And so we see the creation of Eve. And when God began this, he said, I want you to understand how I want my creation and mankind to interact with each other. Not as strangers. He says, I want you to interact as family. God is Father, Adam and Eve, husband and wife, man and woman, brought together as one. In this world today, we see that mankind is definitely a dysfunctional family. Then as we move into Genesis chapter 3, we begin to understand why this family begins to act dysfunctionally. And we see the fall of man and how he relinquishes his dominion that God gave him. And he relinquishes it to God's greatest foe, to Satan himself. And in that act, we see that there is a loss of righteousness. We read how that Adam and Eve, and when they took of the fruit that had been forbidden, they immediately knew they were naked. Well, how come they didn't know they were naked before? Well, because they weren't exactly naked. They had a cloak on them, a robe, so to speak, and that robe was righteousness. They were robed in the righteousness of God. They had a right relationship with God. Therefore, there was no awareness of naked because they weren't naked before God. Once they took of the fruit of that tree that God had forbid them to eat of, then they were naked before God. What was that tree that God said, don't eat of that tree? Well, we know it's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You know, we call a tree by the fruit it yields. We call a cherry tree because its fruit is cherries. We call apple trees because their fruit is apple. And so what kind of a tree is the tree of knowledge of good and evil? What kind of fruit does it produce? It produces knowledge. Knowledge of things good, knowledge of things evil. And when Satan came to them and said, look at this tree, look what it produces. And they were tempted by it and they ate of it. Today, that tree is still being eaten of because man worships knowledge. They worship knowledge of good things. They worship knowledge of bad things. They worship the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You say, well, didn't God want them to know good and evil? Yes, he did. And God was teaching them. It says that God came and walked with them in the cool of the day. The word cool is the same word as spirit. God walked with them in the spirit. What kind of spirit? The spirit of the day. We know from Genesis chapter 1 that God separated light from the darkness, and the light he called day. So what was God walking with them in? He was walking with them in the spirit of light. God wanted to guide their understanding of knowledge, but man chose to make knowledge their God. Without God's guidance, without God's understanding. We see this still play out even in our world today. A good example is the internet. I mean, the knowledge that is on the internet. Thank God for the internet, because as we all went into lockdown and we were not allowed to go to our churches, we found that the internet was God's answer so that we as believers could still join together and not forsake the assembling of ourselves together. And so there has been good as we've allowed God to guide us and lead us in this use of our internet. But then we see the other side where people are using the internet without God's guidance, and the havoc that it's playing in lives and the havoc it's playing in this world. And so even today, the knowledge of good and evil outside of God's guidance becomes absolute detriment to man. As we move on from Genesis chapter 3 to Genesis chapter 4, we now find that there is a fork in the road. We have two lives. Both of them have the same information and the same understanding, but one life determined and decided to take one path, while the other life, the other path. We see the lives of Cain and Abel. Cain acknowledged there was a God, but he had no relationship with God. Abel, on the other hand, not only acknowledged God, but brought gifts to God out of his relationship with God. This is clearly seen when we read Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3. It says, by faith, Abel offered a better sacrifice. How did Abel offer a better sacrifice? He offered it because he believed. He trusted, he had faith in this God. And so we begin to see that there are those who will take one path while others will take another. I pray that this journey that we're on will help us to find the path where God is leading us and guiding us into knowledge, truth, and understanding. Also in Genesis chapter 4, we're introduced to our first genealogy. I'm not going to go into all that, but you will find in your trail mix that there's also some written information, and I go into more detail in this. So if you want to understand why this genealogy is there, you might want to take time to read that document. And we will find that in this first genealogy, what it proclaims is the faithfulness of God. That brings us to our next turn in the road, Genesis chapter 5. Now we are following a path of righteousness. In Genesis chapter 5, we have a genealogy. Once again, if we take time to look at that genealogy, what we're going to see is God is setting up the understanding of Noah and why God chooses Noah. As we look at that genealogy, if you do a timeline, you will discover that from Adam to Noah, the only one who was born after Adam had died was Noah. Everyone else in that genealogy was living on this earth during the time of Adam's lifetime. What that says to us is that for Adam to share his story of creation, all he had to do was he needed to share it with one other person. And we can be certain that Adam shared that information with a man called Methuselah. Methuselah was the longest living human being. And we know that he lived for many years in the time of Adam's lifetime, but also for many years, for 600 years, in the lifetime of Noah. You can be certain that Methuselah, Noah's grandfather, had shared with him the information. And so we find that Noah has a relationship with God, a knowing about God. And in this next part of our journey, you might want to get rid of your boots and get on your gum boots and put on your raincoats, because in this next part, we are introduced to the salvation of man, the first time God saved mankind. It's interesting how that story of Noah and the ark and the salvation that God brought to this earth is comparable to our salvation. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 and 22, it talks about our baptism into Christ, and it says it corresponds to this story of Noah and his household. So as you're reading it, look for those little hints that will show you God's work in our life, in this new creation and in the salvation that God has given to us. That brings us to Genesis chapters 10 and 11. And now we have a moment where we can step into God's scientific lab. In Genesis 10 and 11, we see the separation of the nations after they get off the boat on Mount Ararat, and Noah has his 3 sons and their wives and his wife. They begin to populate this earth. And in Genesis chapter 10, it shows us the spread of that population. When we get into Genesis chapter 11, it tells us why they were pushed out into these areas. And we see that God separated man. It wasn't just man's ideas, it was God's idea to separate them into nations. But how did God separate them into nations? He separated them into nations at the time of Babylon, when God confused their languages. Stop and think about that. When God confused their languages, what did he do? He separated them into smaller groups. As a result of God separating them by their languages, it reduced the gene pool to a certain amount of people who spoke a certain language. Any scientist will tell you that when you reduce gene pools, it's going to cause inbreeding. If you're going to make a hybrid dog, why are there poodles and why are there collies and Great Danes? They all came from the same dog, but as the gene pools were reduced, it created different characteristics. It's my personal belief that when God caused the gene pools to be reduced, and as a result of just breeding with those in their language, it caused characteristics to change. If you wonder why do the Chinese have slanted eyes, and why are the Africans black, I truly believe that it's the result of language that caused the gene pools to become smaller, and as a result of just breeding within that language, it caused characteristics that are now related to those languages. That's my belief. You can take that or leave that, but I do believe that there's enough scientific fact to prove that. And so we see the separation of nations and races, and that brings us to the next genealogy, which is found in Genesis chapter 11. And in that genealogy, we will follow down and we will find that it begins with Noah, but it ends with a man named Abraham. In that genealogy also, you'll find that there's a man that's name is Eber, and Eber plays an important part of that genealogy. Why is Eber so important? We find that at Eber's time, that's when the land was divided, and I believe that's when Babylon happened. And as a result, language divided. And Eber, they can trace the language of Hebrew back to the man Eber. When it talks about Abraham, it says Abraham, the Hebrew. Why is he called the Hebrew? Because he spoke Hebrew, and he was a descendant of Eber. And so as we will continue on, as we start next week and look at our journey, we're going to see this man, Abraham, and what importance he plays in the purpose and the plan of God. Abraham, the man of faith, the Hebrew. I hope you're enjoying this journey. I hope that you are slowing down and not just reading words, but those words are coming alive as you walk through the pages of the book. Look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.